All right, and we are live. So welcome everyone to another chat, Athenaeum Comic Art chat. My name is Sean Watkins, if you didn't know that already, owner of Athenaeum Comic Art. We represent some of the best indie and alt cartoonists in the business, one of which will be, we have the pleasure of speaking with today. Our friend Nate Powell is with us. This is the very end of our month-long celebration of our third year in business, which I'm super excited to talk to Nate, and I'm also excited to take a little break from all of the festivities because I'm tired. But so yeah, excited to chat with Nate tonight. Many of you already know Nate Powell. He is the author of many books. To name a few: March, Fall Through, Lies My Teacher Told Me, Save It for Later, Come Again, Swallow Me Whole, and others. Nate's a National Book Award winner, Robert F. Kennedy Book Award winner, has won multiple Eisners and Ignatz Awards. American Library Association and Young Adult Library Services Association distinctions, Comic-Con International Inkpot Award, and the CXC Transformative Work Award, to name a few of your accolades. Thank you, Nate. I'm so excited to talk to you tonight.
You bet. Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for talking with me.
Yeah. So we're just going to have a conversation here, have a list of questions. If folks in the audience are interested in submitting any questions, feel free to post them, and maybe we'll get to them tonight. So Nate, I've seen you talk a lot about your sort of background in indie comics and kind of the punk scene. But I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you started self-publishing. A lot of folks that I work with are in this sort of indie space, and I have a pretty wide range of folks in terms of careers, as well as the type of art that they do, the type of comics that they do. But I think, you have such an interesting, unique path to comics, particularly, starting in the early 90s. And I'd love to hear just a little bit about what those experiences were like, starting. I think on your website it said maybe at 15 you started with your first self-published.
Yeah.
14.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I grew up in pre-internet Arkansas, and I got into drawing my own comics with my best friend and kind of like creative partner, both musically and comics wise, this guy, Mike Lyerly, also from North Little Rock, Arkansas. And he was the person who, I'd been drawing since I was 3. I'd been reading comics since I was 3, but I never put 2 and 2 together to actually draw comics. Mike, once we started really hanging out all the time, he'd been drawing for a couple of years, and he drew just a really sick Wolverine. How'd you do that? He's like, have you ever read any Arthur Adams comics? And then, within a matter of days, if not like the same day that all these revelations came to me, he was like, we should make comics together. And it actually took him saying those words before I realized, wait, why am I not making comics? That's exactly what I want to do. And we kind of just never looked back from that. So we worked together on a couple of series very intensely in 7th and 8th grade, and then shifted to the one we would begin self-publishing, which I will actually get the first issue.
I was going to ask if you had that still. That's amazing.
Yeah, you bet. Here it is. Yeah. So it was like the first month of 9th grade, we published the first issue of DOA, which
wow.
Kind of like a dystopian guns and boobs superhero comic. It's like, part X-Men, part Akira, and part, like dark apocalyptic prophecy or something.
Relevant today.
Yeah, of course. And at the time, that was like at the peak of the Image Comics boom. And we were watching, like the younger artists that would be a part of Image were, in our minds, they were like 20-year-old millionaires for 6 months, probably. But as 14-year-old comic book lovers, we were getting mad almost instantly that these 20-year-old millionaires were already blowing their deadlines. And some of them, half of them, we realized we could draw as well or better than them as high school students. So we actually tapped into that rage and we're like, you know what, when we self-publish our own comic, we are going to make it come out every 2 months and keep it on a schedule. And motivated by that rage, we actually did it.
Wow.
But that sort of helped instill a sense of discipline that kind of piggybacked on getting more deeply involved in do-it-yourself punk at the time, which was extremely strong in Little Rock, Arkansas, throughout the 1990s. And so we started our main band the same month we began self-publishing comics, and in a lot of ways, like they just became deeper and deeper intertwined. And so I self-published for 10 years. Before I started working with other publishers, Soft Skull Press at first, then Top Shelf. And I was still working a full-time job for that first decade before things started to kind of get busy enough to take a chance to quit my job. But yeah, I think of indie comics as a creative community as being very similar to the kind of 90s, 2000s underground do-it-yourself punk community that forged me. And I mean, a lot of it in terms of people taking chances on each other, a lot of the attendant social and political issues, a lot of the ways people would go about learning how to do what they were going to do as they did it. And, skill sharing with each other, developing networks amongst each other. There were just a lot of parallels. And so I think of those two communities as being pretty deeply intertwined in my development as a cartoonist.
You mentioned the sort of anger as a driving force with getting those comics out on time. And when I think of you, I think of like one of the chillest, calmest dudes I've ever met in my life. And I kind of wonder, you think of kind of punk especially as sort of this way to express emotion. I'd love to hear sort of more about that, the sort of anger that was stirring at that time, or those, maybe not even anger is maybe not the right word, but sort of frustration about the status quo, right? Like challenging authority and things like that. And how I'd be curious to hear, where you started at 14 versus where you are now.
You bet. Well, I'd say like getting into punk and getting into self-publishing comics in pre-internet Arkansas, if we're talking about like the immediate aftermath of the first Gulf War, and being an Arkansan where our local boy, Bill Clinton, governor of the state, in real time ascended to the White House. And so like our experience of electoral politics, or at least mine as a ninth grader, and really like all of the local punk people, I feel like there was our perception of how everything worked was really skewed because it was literally a guy down the street. Like my band's first show played in what was his backyard.
Oh, wow.
Only 3 months after he moved out to move into the White House.
Wow.
And this is something that a lot of us kind of took for granted in Central Arkansas, and even just the idea of like, whatever, like lunch pail Democrats, blue dog Democrats. It gave me kind of a skewed perception of what would become a very politically polarized culture. So at the same time, moving into like the flush, irony thick 90s, there was that sense of like that sense of calm progress, but also like the reality being like those were also kind of the most dangerous years of my life as like a young skater child, like getting chased by actual like gangsters and, like gun-toting hillbillies, but also riding around with some kind of sketchy gangster skaters as well. There was like a tension simmering under the surface of everything. And in terms of punk and in terms of how this impacted my storytelling perspective, this is during the transition from the second to the third waves of emo in hardcore punk. And so it involved, like really people putting their heart on their sleeves and allowing a very personal as political approach to their lyrics, to their music, and kind of like branching out a little bit, trying to mature, and then things would move in waves where people would get a little more concrete and political about things. There would be, a very healthy dynamic tension. But when I started writing and drawing zines in addition to making comics, because it took me a while to realize they didn't have to be separate things.
Right.
So I put all my feelings in like bad poetry and stuff. I put all that in my zines. But now when I read my writing in like my fiction graphic novels, it really is just it's a slightly craftier version of the kind of approach I would have to my zine writing as like a 16-year-old. So in a lot of ways, yeah, the more I try to kind of like grow and branch out, I have these moments in particular books where I feel like I'm coming back to my home planet. Like with my newest book, Fall Through, it's very much that. It sort of reckons with that entire path in early mid-90s punk and emo, and being at this transitional creative moment and not really being able to define it and not really knowing what it is until you're looking back on it. But yeah, I feel like a lot of my aesthetic approach and creative approach is still owes a pretty deep debt to those formative years.
And you had mentioned, kind of looking at those Image folks. Obviously, you're a big X-Men person. How much did those mainstream comics affect you? And when did you start kind of seeing more indie comics?
Okay, well, if I had to pick like two artists that are probably still my most influential two cartoonists, it's still 1980s X-Men artists. It's Arthur Adams and Bill Sienkiewicz. And when I'm really tapping in every once in a while, I feel like I'm channeling a Sienkiewicz moment here, and it's never far away. But I would say, okay, I did luck out because as an actual elementary school child, my comic book store in Alabama actually exposed me early to Scott McCloud's
Understanding Comics.
It's crazy oversized book that's called it's not like POW or whatever. I have it over there, but
Zap?
No, it's not Zap.
No.
It's well, whatever. We'll get to it. I'll write it in the comments later. It was this oversized black and white sort of ironic superhero fight that actually had like a giant lettering of the word asshole during a punch. And I was like, what? And I was also exposed to pre-cartoon, pre-licensing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles right at the end there. And so I was like, what is this? This art actually looks dirty. I was like, this is splattered all over. Like, this is grimy art. What is this? And so those planted some seeds, but really, other than those mid-'80s moments, I had almost no awareness of comics narratives that weren't superhero comics or like power-based plots until about 96. I did have some awareness of Love and Rockets because there were a decent number of punk show flyers in Little Rock in the early 90s that just, that used Love and Rockets clip art for the flyer. And I was like, what is that? But basically, it was like once I moved away and moved to the East Coast for college around 1996, all of a sudden I was like, whoa. They're like comics. That was the first time I understood that comics were just a language, a medium, and a format of their own, and that comics could be anything. So the first graphic novels that really were kind of put in my lap, like read this and be changed by it, were Chester Brown's I Never Liked You. That was a huge deal. And Eric Drucker's Flood, which is also a wordless graphic novel and is a fairly like political graphic novel as well. So both of those just really did a number on me.
And Was the aspiration always to be a cartoonist? You said you made comics for about 10 years before kind of becoming a professional cartoonist, but was that always the goal? Were you thinking of other careers and this was just sort of a hobby? Were you really passionate about sort of kind of getting to that point of your career?
Okay, so from that first moment where Mike Lyerly was like, we should make comics together, I was 100% in on doing comics as my life for my life. And so that carried me all the way through high school and, into college and everything. However, as I wound up going to school at School of Visual Arts in New York City for cartooning. And by that point, I had my own thing going on. I had my own stories in mind, and I was trying to make my assignments fit the work I was already doing. Mm-hmm. But I can't emphasize enough that I was really I had kind of like punk tunnel vision, where my entire life was based around my band back in Arkansas, when and where we were going to tour, record, play shows. And so even though there were all these opportunities around me, and lots of my classmates were like, they would stay in New York City for the summer, and they'd get an internship at Marvel or Nickelodeon or whatever. By the time I finished school, like I didn't even go to my graduation because it meant I would have had to stick around for days. And I was like, I have to practice with my band. We're leaving on tour in like a week. And it just never crossed my mind that itself was an enormous decision I was making. And so like a lot of my classmates, like Farrell Dalrymple, Becky Cloonan, Dave Roman, Raina Telgemeier, a lot of these people, all, like sort of had this, it certainly wasn't a meteoric rise, but it's what happens when you stick around and you're like, I'm going to see where this goes for me here in New York City as I try to figure out cartooning. And I basically turned my back on all that for a few years. And I was like, because I wasn't being flexible, I was like, I don't think there's any way for me to actually be a full-time cartoonist. It just can't be done. So, I was like, I'm just going to keep doing my thing, and I'll keep making my comics. The other big passion in my life, because of my family circumstances and a lot of other related issues, was I spent 10 years of my life, my first career was doing direct care and advocacy work for adults with developmental disabilities. And I would have been perfectly happy doing that if that's the way that things turned out. I did all of Swallow Me Whole while doing overnight shifts at work and just staying awake and inking my pages. And basically once Swallow Me Whole came out and people started knocking on my door just a little bit about work, I would actually turn them down at first, where they're like, hey, you want to draw this graphic novel? And which would have been like The Silence of Our Friends, published by First Second. But I'd be like, oh, I don't think I can do that because I'm like working on my own book. And if I did that, like I wouldn't have enough time to work my job and do both books. And then I'd be like, wait, is this where I quit my job? So I was like, I'll try it and I'll see if it'll last for a few months. And thankfully it has lasted for 15 years.
Yeah, that's amazing. I had some questions from come in around punk, not to pull us back to punk, but sure. Your life is punk.
Welcome anytime. Yeah.
It's just interesting to me. I'd love to hear you talk more about that community and that pull, right? Because it seems like the only kind of experience I have that's anywhere near that was as an adult starting to work at a gifted and talented educational summer camp. And it kind of became a camp for adults as well. And I went back for years and years. Eventually I worked there full time, and the community kind of like pulled me in. And it was so powerful and it was so strong because it's living with people. Like you are living with people for a very intense period of time. And I see some connections to kind of what you've been talking about, but I'd love to hear, like, what was that like for you as a kind of, as you were forming your own identity in this space and having these wonderful opportunities or potential opportunities in New York, but saying, I'd rather go back and play with my band?
Well, I mean, a lot of this really is just being a young person, and if there is momentum behind something that's going on around you, the momentum has an outsized gravity, you know? So a lot of that was my band, Sufi Nun Squad, was also kind of an expansive, weird family. Like, I mean, including actual family. Like, there were siblings. There was a couple that then got married within the band. You know, like a lot of things became very deeply intertwined. So we were very much like a Muppet movie style adventure package. And the emotional depth of being in a band family sort of superseded, like, it wasn't an option to step away from that, especially when it seemed to be the central creative outlet in all of our lives. And it was a creative outlet that was entirely different than what I was doing, like, you know, at my desk all by myself,
right,
with my weird loner comics. It was satisfying in a very different way. So I'd say, like, in terms of community, a lot of it really is like not only discovering who your people are, which is really that, like, you've got your own thing going on, and then you stumble across some other young people who are doing something somewhat similar, and you're like, oh, there's more of you out here.
Yeah.
And like, even as like an 8th and 9th grader, that's really what it was like in Little Rock when I discovered punk. It wasn't even about, like, the music was interesting to me because I was already like a metalhead or whatever. And so I was like, oh yeah, this is like high energy, aggressive music. But a lot of it was, I was like, I draw comics. I like loud music. I want to make things. And then all of a sudden it's like this window opens and I'm like, wait, there are these other high schoolers all over my town. And most of them in these little pockets are already like, they're putting out tapes and records. They're making zines. There were a couple of cartoonists in there. That weird guy who goes to my family's church, who's a few years older. It turns out he's the weird guy because he's one of the elder punk teens. Right. I'm like, oh, I'm like, these are my people. And so the older I got, a lot of it was this idea that as that local thing becomes sort of a national sense of belonging and making and building something together. And that means like making fests, you know, like not just booking shows, but like trying to build these cultural elements and like doing potlucks and like fundraising and becoming more socially conscious together. And then that even transcending national boundaries, like beginning to tour in Europe and beginning to be pen pals with people all across the world. There was just an incredible gravity that was entirely different from comics when at the time I wasn't aware. And really, like, the ability of indie comics at the time to have a network like that felt like that way was very, very much in its early stages. So my first indie comic con was probably MoCA in 2003.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, because that was leading to my next question, which was around, you know, I talked to a lot of cartoonists about, you know, the act of cartooning is very, isolating isn't the right word, but sort of you're sitting at your desk drawing, you know, oftentimes at your house or whatever in an office, and you're not around people as much. Yeah. I mean, I think if you go back into like Marvel Comics land, there's lots of examples of folks like drawing in a big space with people all around them.
Yeah.
The bullpen or whatever. So I think it can be like that, but you know, what's the comics community been like for you, and how has that changed? You know, it sounds like you came much later to some of these small press kind of community spaces, but I'd love to hear kind of, you know, how those spaces have affected you as, you know, as a comic book artist.
Yeah, I mean, it's been one of the healthiest additions to my life over these past 2 decades. Initially, like when Tiny Giants, which was my first non-self-published book, when that came out in 2003, basically, like, you know, it was one of these wake-up calls where I realized a lot of the work when trying to like let the world know about your book, a lot of that was still DIY. And it was like getting lists of contacts through people and calling them or emailing them yourself, and then booking a tour for yourself and driving yourself and selling the books yourself. And that's my jam anyway. So I was like, okay, I can just ease right into this. However, those first few years, especially because I was very, very deeply involved in punk as a community and culture, this is like the dark side of punk baggage, where, and I kind of get into this a little bit in my new book, Fall Through. It's the idea of punk being both like being such an inclusive and expansive culture, but it's actually built on exclusion.
Right.
It's built on like rejecting and developing parameters. It's basically saying no to a bunch of stuff, and whatever has not been rejected yet falls under punk. But that shifts, like it, you know. And so in my punk mindset, starting to go to these early shows for indie comics, it was sort of giving me blinders to the fact that a lot of the same stuff was there creatively and socially. And so I'd be like, well, like it doesn't have everything, or, you know, whatever. But eventually once Sufi Nun Squad broke up and I started finally making some shifts in my life around 2006, 7, 8, all of a sudden it occurred to me that, like, you know, all that was BS, that like I could finally see comics more clearly as a community and be like, oh wait, people are still taking the same risks, like by coming to these weird shows in hotel ballrooms and, like, you know, blowing their whole paycheck on a table space, giving away a bunch of comics, trading, but also like the fact that, as I tell many like young up and coming artists who might ask me for advice, like so much of it is about showing up in physical space. And like, you may think like, it's not just like expect to give away half of your books at first, etc. But it's the idea that you may feel like people don't notice or appreciate your presence, like you're on the outside looking in. But it really, after like by your third Comic Con or whatever, people have noticed and remembered that you're there. And so a lot of it is like, you know, cartoonists always have a legitimacy battle. Like we've got the war in each of our own heads where we're like, like major imposter syndrome with everything we do, and we're always trying to like prove that this isn't a waste or whatever. But like comics as a creative community in physical space, in a lot of ways, is like the antidote to that, because it's a reminder. Be like, oh right, we're all doing this in our own little caves, and we make these pilgrimages, and we're like, oh, I do know you. Like, this is what you've been doing for the past 6 months. And you know, like, it's that first revelation that someone remembers your name or they recognize your art or whatever. That was a major shift. And then also recognizing that people are also, you know, these are like, comics is full of like creative, concerned, empathetic people making empathy machines, you know. And so like, obviously a lot of the same social and political issues are, you know, near the forefront of comics as a culture. Like a lot of the same discussions are happening, though in different waves and at different times than my own experience through punk. There are just so many parallels. I was just blind to it for a while. So I find it a lot more satisfying to be in comics now, because generally comics is way less judgmental. It's much more actually inclusive. Right. Without having a veneer of righteousness, really. Like, I'm making generalizations here, but like the actual sense of inclusion and welcomeness to people who want to participate in the comics world is a very real thing. And it's something that I need a lot, especially as, you know, like somebody who spends my whole life in here, who's like also like a secret, like grumbly, judgmental jerk or whatever. Yeah.
A lot of us are. It's okay.
Yeah.
I love that you talk to kind of up and coming folks about physical spaces, because, you know, Athenaeum started during the pandemic, and, you know, I think I have some punk sensibilities in the sense that, you know, I'm very much I'm going to do it my own way. I'm going to charge my own path. And, you know, I was hesitant at first to go and attend some of the small press shows for whatever reason. And I have had so many amazing experiences. Granted, I'm privileged and I'm not a cartoonist and whatever, like it's a different vibe, but I have been able to, so many great experiences and business opportunities and collaborations and friendships have just happened through, turning around and seeing somebody and being like, oh, hey, I like your stuff. Yeah. And I think, especially in this, for a lot of cartoonists that are coming up in this world where you can do almost everything yourself, you can do it digitally, you can sell your stuff from your house. I think that those physical spaces are still really, really important. And folks, if they can, right, not everyone lives near a space that's going to have a show, although it seems like more and more are coming back, which is really exciting in all parts of the country. But I always recommend that folks attend one, even if they're not tabling, just go and say hello to people, because in my experience as well, feeling very much like an outsider, like I'm not a creative, in this way, at least, folks were so welcoming and curious, and they're like, do you want to go to this event after the show? And I'm like, sure, am I allowed to go to it? I think there's not enough that can be said about those experiences,
Well, also, I mean, the most pleasant surprise of all is that there are very few people who are actually kind of aloof dicks in the world of comics. Very few. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because like there's the idea, it shows what a small pond comics is, even in whether it's the world of art or the world of publishing. But people talk to each other, people vouch for each other, but people also warn each other about other people, and so like obviously comics is also full of problems and people who can be predatory and can exploit each other. But in general, 96% of the time, it's been so pleasant just to be like, oh, yeah, exactly what you were saying. You find yourself next to someone else where you're like, wait a minute. Oh, I really like this book that you did. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I have a vague awareness that you exist as well. And then you recognize that the notion of celebrity and achievement within the world of comics is it's like it's a little bit it's just enough of an illusion. It's really easy to kind of like cast a lot of that aside when you're actually breaking bread together and on a convention floor together. I think it's a lovely thing to be a part of.
Yes, I agree. I can't have a conversation with you without talking about March, of course. So it's been over 10 years now since the first book came out. How has your relationship with that project that's so much a part of your life, how has that changed over the years, reflecting back, 10 years, 10 or what is it, 11 years now?
11, yeah.
11 years. What was that experience for you as sort of this book that is so beloved, it's so significant. I've talked about this before, but my spouse Deborah, that book was the first year book at University of Maryland. So every student that came into University of Maryland read that book, and John Lewis came to speak. It was a really cool event. But be interested to hear sort of how that changed you as an artist, as a person, and what is it like kind of looking back on it 11 years down the road?
Like on one level, it's it was a wonderful thing for both Andrew and I to have the dust settle a bit at first after the initial trilogy was finished. And then, like we needed our own time and space while we were working with Fury on doing Run, but also in the midst of that, losing Congressman Lewis, and trying to figure out what was going to happen, if anything, with a continuation of Run, deciding to let it quietly rest. I'd say like during these past, I guess it's been 13 years since I actually started researching and getting to work penciling stuff. a lot of it is inseparable from making work about America and the power of the people in the streets in the mid 20th century, while America in the streets of the 2010s was having its own sort of parallel upheaval and reckoning with the era depicted in March. And that impacted the ways in which John Lewis and Andrew and I approached making March in real time. And I think one thing that sort of is forgotten is the fact that we were making and releasing these books at the same time that we were touring around and talking about the books, at the same time that there was this explosion of national conversation, these organic protest movements, and also a massive counter reaction from a now consolidated kind of mainstreamed fascist right. So a lot of that was really just like being in the trenches as much as possible. And also recognizing not only my own privilege, but my own obligations as a parent of young children at the time, and like doing the most that I could do with the time and energy that I had. I guess coming out, through the 2020s and looking back, even though it just doesn't feel like looking back at all. It's like, I think I said this and save it for later, but I feel like this is an extended moment that we're living. Like the last decade has just been one extended moment, and we're experiencing time in kind of a telescoped way.
Yeah.
But, my relationship to March now is very much that, Andrew and I both, we regularly kind of discuss that, it's what a weird experience that without Congressman Lewis with us, it's out for the rest of our lives. It's our responsibility, but also like our joy and our honor to protect his, the legacy of all of our work together, but also the legacy of his work as a young person at the center of the civil rights movement through the work we made together, which involves also, like the process of making that books was the process of reintroducing and recontextualizing the entire history of the civil rights movement.
Right.
Being stuck in the middle of that with all of these like right-wing reality averse book banning movements, like there isn't a lot of time to look back, because now a lot of it is just seeing, what strategies are being implemented in response to, a changing, growing America, and, these sort of like reality averse, desperate efforts to push us back to the 1950s, which is absolutely not going to happen. But that it's a matter of like how many decades are we going to need to commit to protecting, each other, and to protecting like the legacy of an America that's a lot more diverse and interesting, and in need of protection than the reality averse right would have us believe.
Yeah. And I think as well about, the sort of trajectory, or maybe the sort of collective memory of our country in the way that it looks at the civil rights movement, if at all, and sort of this whitewashing or sort of, highlighting heroes without talking about sort of their complex ideas. How do you have thoughts about sort of how we continue that legacy of John Lewis in a way that's constructive and allows for sort of a holistic view of what was happening, as well as parallels, as well as kind of using that as a lens through which to look at our current political situation? That's a big question, I think, but
it's not that big. It's not that big.
Okay.
What you're saying is actually like very well worded. This kind of goes back to John Lewis's core initial interest in making March the way that we made it. One of the main things he would always come back to as like a mantra was simply about how the civil rights movement was a decentralized movement. the reality of the movement, how and why it worked, had to do with the power of the people making change. And one reason why March was made was, Andrew and John Lewis were both very, very committed to sort of inverting the way a lot of us were taught about how the civil rights movement worked and from which direction change happened. So Andrew refers to it as a tale of gods and kings. And I just think of it as a hierarchical thing where it's like, leaders are able to make change happen. And then the people who are involved, experience that change. We know that change never happens from the top in that way. And so from day one, John Lewis was like, the most important thing to like really get into people's heads is the fact that hierarchical centralized model of how the movement worked is just incorrect. But we have to show, and also that means show how, complicated and messy and imperfect and at times boring and tragic and dirty and contradictory the movement could be. And being a Southern kid who grew up in the 80s and was taught by my Southern baby boomer parents, the kinds of the civil rights movement history narrative that they learned, as teenagers in real time, but also by the early 70s, there was this kind of mythologized, smoothed over, streamlined version of civil rights movement history that kind of made a clean break from the past to the present and disallowed the ability even for them as young adults in the early 70s to see connections between the world they lived in and the world that they had just lived in 5 to 10 years prior. And I got a lot of that sense of unease when I was learning as a kid, but I couldn't articulate that.
Yeah.
So for me, it was very personal to reckon with the fact that I had been mistaught most of the history of the civil rights movement, though my parents did a good job trying, with their own memories and experiences and with what they had. To me, it was very personal. So like when I started working on Lies My Teacher Told Me, that's one of James Lowen's main points is not only the problem of what he calls heroification in teaching history, like where, American history, when learning history, we don't like for heroes to have complicated or contradictory ideas or things that make us uncomfortable, even though that's the interesting stuff.
Right.
So our account of history often leaves that stuff out, but in there is all the stuff that's the connective tissue that makes it all make sense. So people are just left kind of confused, or it doesn't seem to, you can't really get where you're going when you leave out all that stuff. And he was also very focused on the power of misleading people by mythologizing our national history, and sort of having this larger narrative that historical facts have to fit into. And if they don't, they're simply left out. So when we were doing March, we were always bringing ourselves back around to trying to remember and highlight the people who had intentionally been swept under the rug or sort of left to the sides as that streamlined, simplified, mythologized version of history was hammered out. And I'm just thankful that John Lewis, was always aware and was always committed to speaking his memory, of his first person experiences within the movement, and to highlighting that things were messy, they were complicated, they involved tons of people, etc. This is the stuff of actual life.
I love that you brought up Lies My Teacher Told Me, because I was thinking as you were talking and kind of preparing for this conversation about my own experience growing up in Northern New York with working class parents who were also kind of anti-authority, which was really interesting. And you had said sort of, you had this like spider sense kind of vibe about like something's off here. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something not quite right. And I remember reading People's History of the United States, the Howard Zinn. Yeah. And it really, that book blew my mind in so many ways. And it started me down more of a constructive path of we are literally being lied to almost all of the time. And it showed me how important critical thinking was, and kind of pushing back against what many folks just sort of accept as truth. I wonder, do you have moments in your kind of upbringing where you remember sort of these points of conflict, of sort of challenging authority, or kind of coming to a realization that you were being lied to?
Yes, I mean, I'd say there would be the most potent memories I have, where like the very earliest one is pretty intense. It's featured in Save It for Later. But, like as a 5-year-old, this was like my earliest actual glitch in the Matrix, where I just moved to Alabama, and my family, we were headed up to Anniston or Huntsville, maybe to go see like whatever, like the NASA station that's there or something. Anyway, outside of Anniston, Alabama, we were going through this small town just outside, and in the middle of the day, in the like town square, I saw a fully robed Klan circle with a giant cross and everything. And I had no idea what any of it was. It was instantly terrifying to me, but I had no context. It was just otherworldly and terrifying. And so I remember asking my parents, I was like, what is that? And I remember them giving each other the look from the front seat. They're like, oh, well, there goes that window of sweet obliviousness. And so at that level, they explained who the Klan was, etc. But very quickly kind of tried to contextualize it by explaining that, like, that they really represented a different time. And that different time was the time in which they were kids and teenagers, during the civil rights movement and just before it, as Mississippian baby boomers. But like about most of the time, my lessons about like civil rights movement history or segregation or racism was 50% information and memory, and 50% the legwork to try to not make a connection to the present. So growing up in Montgomery, Alabama, I visited a lot of the locations that I later had to draw in March Book 2, March Book 3. I'd been to a lot of the places throughout Alabama. And I was able to tap into my own childhood memory for a lot of those sites. I had like really, it certainly made an impression on me. But when I was learning from my parents or from Alabama history books, like as a 4th grader about segregation and the civil rights movement, there was that you could almost touch the desire to like not make a connection. And it was strange because I'm like, I've been to this place that's like 5 miles from my house. But everyone is sort of addressing it like it was something that happened centuries ago, when it was something that would have happened 15 to 20 years prior. And now I can look back and like 15 years is nothing.
Right.
And so those were the early moments where like there's a disturbance around you and you're not aware of why things aren't adding up or what it means. But you know that there's more to know, but you don't know how to get there. You don't know how to know what you don't know yet.
Yeah. And I mean, for me, those moments, I study cultural studies. I look at the world through a kind of critical lens. And so you think that you kind of like, there's a point where you're like, I know all this stuff already. Like I know kind of what the world is. And I'll just this quick anecdote. My mother grew up in Port Jervis, New York, and went to visit every year, blah, blah, blah. Last year, I found out that there was a lynching that happened about half a mile from where my mom lived in like the late 1800s. It's Stephen Crane was inspired to write a short story about it because one of his relatives was at the lynching. And my cousin's husband has since written this huge book about it, but it was something that no one had ever talked to me about. my mother is half Black. We're a mixed family, and even she didn't know about it. It wasn't taught. It was such a moment, especially being in the North in the late 1800s. It was a huge, scandalous, terrible event that happened, but was so quickly swept under the rug. And I think of, I'm almost 40, and these things are still coming out. They're important for us to talk about and to know, right? Because without that, in my opinion, right, we aren't reflecting on kind of where we've been and where we are and how easy it is to replicate those horrible atrocities in the current time, if we're not having a conversation about what the foundation of our country is. Certainly. And that's why I think Lies My Teacher Told Me is such an important book, and I love that you have transformed it into graphic novel form, because that means it'll be accessible to even more folks. Was that sort of was that experience, I don't know, was it cathartic in some ways, is kind of going through? I mean, I'm sure it was difficult as well, because you have to kind of visualize some really horrifying parts of our history.
I mean, that's true, but that aspect, along with a lot of other aspects, including some very nuts and bolts parts of the process, I feel like I had equipped myself to take on the project pretty well because of doing the March trilogy.
Right.
So for me, like, it's interesting that both Fall Through and Lies My Teacher Told Me were done simultaneously. They were both done during the entirety of the pandemic, like back to back. So really, like, it was like I was the book loving, like the bookworm in the Twilight Zone episode, where all of a sudden I had the time to like make the books I really wanted to make. Mm-hmm. And I felt really blessed, really #blessed to actually be able to commit that amount of time to the exact books I wanted to make at that, and felt like I needed to make at that moment. A lot of the content within Lies My Teacher Told Me, what's also inseparable from this is that James Lowen got in touch with me right before the pandemic, like January 2020. He emailed me out of the blue. And he had met Andrew and John Lewis at a book festival, but we had never met in person. And he was like, "Oh, I don't know if you're familiar with my book, Lies My Teacher Told Me." Obviously I was I'd read it many times, but also his subsequent book, Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension of American Racism. That was, for me, that was a real touchstone that impacted all of my work from 2007 on, and radically shifted my thinking and my perspective and my memories, especially as a Southerner who settled down in the Midwest. It was right up my alley, and it really, really rocked my world. But he was just wondering if I wanted to adapt it. I immediately wrote back without even contacting my agent or anybody. And I was like, yes, we'll work out the details, like, when the time comes, but like, I'm pretty much ready to go on this. Like, I know how it's going to look. Very excited. Let's just do this. Mm-hmm. So I feel like a lot of the nuts and bolts stuff from March allowed me to already kind of visualize how it would work. I had read it 5 times maybe already, so I knew that I would have to do a lot of whittling away. Right. But also, James Lowen, from our very first phone call, was very upfront that he had stage 4 cancer, and that he's like, I don't know if I'll live for 6 years or 6 months or whatever, but basically, this is a full adaptation of my work. Like, you are doing the book solo, and part of the reason why is you need to carry the torch. Mm-hmm. And, for better or for worse, this is another thing that I had to develop, an ability to do by caretaking for John Lewis's legacy through our work. And so I felt like I was kind of uniquely prepared for that very heavy aspect of our work. It was also strange, you kind of doing it into the unknown, not knowing not only what kind of world the book would be published into, but what James Lowen's, what what Jim's fate was going to be in context for the book. But with all those things considered, it really was the right book at the right time that kind of fell in my lap in a moment in which, like at a transitional moment where I was basically able to dedicate all my energy to it.
Mm. You talked a little bit about process, and a question came in from Phil Hester, one of my favorite cartoonists. And he asks, can you have Nate walk through his process from script to inks? I need to know how much he nails down or doesn't before he pencils and inks, thumbs, layouts, etc.
You bet. Okay, so I'm a slow writer. I'm also a weaker writer than an artist. So I know this. And over time, this means like I'm always working on probably 2 books simultaneously, but at different stages, so that, usually I'm only actually drawing the pages of one at a time. But this means like, for example, Diana is the next like fiction graphic novel that I'm doing. And so I'm pretty far in there, but, I have like a separate notebook where for each book, I'm like taking notes and everything and just like writing in a sketchbook and drawing like little tiny images and panels. Then once that starts to crystallize, like for me, like the trifecta is like the major themes and big ideas, all of these little moments and scenes and vignettes that seem unrelated, but they would be cool to draw. And they just need to have a relationship to each other. And then a character who I really care about, who I'm ready to just draw all the time. And once all those things come together, then I'm like, the book, like the actual story can start to emerge from the fog. So I go from this to the index card stage, which is my favorite. Okay, so I cut up, I can't actually show you what's on these because it's secret.
Spoilers.
You don't even know what it is, Sean. The world will know someday. Okay, so basically, like I cut up these little index cards, and like for Diana, I wound up with like probably 150 of them for a 300-page book. But I just get a ton of them, and then each one of those little moments, those little like scenes, vignettes, reflections, they each go on a separate index card. And then I will get on my floor and I will physically start laying out the cards and then kind of start rearranging them physically to see what their relationship is to each other. And once I feel like, oh, right, there definitely seems to be some kind of a connection here, like I'll shuffle them around for a while, I'll make a little progress, and then I'll put them back in that order. And then a few days later, I'll get them out and I'll keep doing it. It has like a tarot-like quality, but after about 5 rounds of that, I'm like, oh, there is a story that has started to develop. And it used to be this like haphazard smattering of index cards. And eventually it's just like this nice little diagonal flow on the floor. And then from there, I'm able to kind of type up a nice clean outline. As some readers of my fiction may know, making sense is a little lower down on the totem pole for me. So that's actually where I'm like, okay, I actually know what happens in this book. What I need to do now is actually write that down in a clear, concrete way so that people who aren't me can be like, oh, right, this is not just nonsense. And that's actually something I learned while doing March, was like the necessity of being clear and concrete so that I can take that back to my weird stuff and it just works better. And from there, then things start moving really fast. So I do my pencils, so here's a page from Diana. Most of my pages now are about 11 by 16. And my pencils are fairly rough. I'm going to try to get this close to without like burning out the screen. But my pencils are fairly loose because I like to think with most of my ink. I like to think with the ink or whatever. And I pencil the entire book. But I also, this is where I start actually putting in dialogue and like voiceover captions. My scripting really happens as I'm penciling it, which is where I wind up. To me, it's more interesting. I wind up with more empty space and like I don't overdo the writing. So I pencil the whole thing. I submit it as pencils, and then I kind of like whittle at it. But I don't even like do tighter edits on the script until I'm approaching the inks and I'm actually lettering it on the page. I give myself a lot of opportunities to just like look at what I'm doing, make little tweaks, which is why this is my last little point in case I'm getting boring.
No, I love it.
I recommend that everyone put your stuff in a binder as you're doing it, because it's like, I'll do like my rough pencils and then I'll scan my pencils in as I go. I print them out and then I put them in this binder. So like at first for this book, Diana, I have an entire book that's just pencils. And then as I'm looking at it, like you can sort of visualize it as a finished book, even when you've barely done anything. It just seems more real. But also that helps me at least look and see where things need to be redrawn, need to be rewritten, and it's a low risk deal. And then when I go back through and I start like inking and coloring the pages, I just replace them in the binder, and I still make notes on the side of like mistakes I've made. And as I tell my kids who are possibly downstairs still watching this live, I make mistakes every day on every page I do. And so it's a matter of just noting every mistake that I do. And that way, like if I have to fix 200 errors, it's still not a big deal. So I like this kind of holistic way where like I'm building up some version of the finished book the entire time. Yeah, because comics are weird. It just takes years to make a book, and so it seems really daunting. But those are my Jedi mind tricks to make it seem a little more piecemeal and a little more satisfying.
I love it. We're coming towards the end of our chat. Just a couple more questions. So I'm glad you brought up sort of ambiguity. I love I think Fall Through. Come Again has long been my favorite book of yours, but I Fall Through might be my new favorite book. It's just so gorgeous. I think it's your art at sort of like the top of your skills. It's really exciting to look at it, but also the story as well as kind of the community vibe of those folks being so close together and sort of those interconnections is something I think is really beautiful too. But we had a question come in about referencing an Instagram post you had put up about a week ago about ambiguity and storytelling and sort of valuing this space of ambiguity, curiosity, deeper truth, open-ended and circular endings, and faith in a contract with the reader. The question is, what gets you excited about storytelling that leans into ambiguities?
For me, it's like, as I'm watching a movie, as I'm reading a book or a comic, what draws me back to a story, what makes me want to watch a movie again is most of the time, and it's always been this way since I was like, 12, is the ending of a story that either seems to be not completely resolved, that seems to end where it began, that seems to be left with room for doubt, or that seems to question what you just experienced as a viewer or a reader, that sort of invites you to be like, check for yourself. Read it again, watch it again. I was always drawn to that. And I think one of the earliest moments, it's more just vibes than like a concrete analogy, that it's the end of Terminator 2, where it's just like John Connor and Sarah Connor, I think it's just headlights on the freeway at the very end. And that John Connor has a voiceover that takes us out of the movie, but it's just headlights on a freeway on blacktop at night. And it gives you the sense that even though you've seen this like epic adventure, the fact that not only does their story continue, but ultimately with, because as we know, the dystopian struggle that happens throughout the Terminator is that, they have hopefully altered the course of things, but what we just watched was just a tiny sliver of what they have to experience as they get to this ocean of unknown future to see if it has, if they've successfully altered things. And so to me, it was just so enticing to be like, wow, like anything can happen in the future of this movie, and yet they're just cutting us off here. Like these characters are alive, and they have actually gone on into the distance without us. And so it left you with that sense of longing. Like if you want more, watch the movie again. It's all you get. So to me, that was an early thing that planted a seed for me. It was like I wanted to capture that feeling. But also a lot of it is like, this sounds kind of like art school nonsense, but it's very real, and it's something that people should take seriously. I'm more interested in asking questions with the major themes and stuff in my stories than I am with like laying things out or giving answers or building a world or explaining things or tying things up. Like one of my, I'd say like Ray Bradbury and Ursula K. Le Guin are probably the two biggest influences on me in Italo Calvino, in terms of writing stories that pull us into these wild worlds with very creative writing and delivery, but which also ask very large questions about humanity or about the nature of the characters involved, and don't necessarily give us the answer. I don't know, like The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin, I think does that perfectly. And even like shorter sections of stories by Italo Calvino, I think does this in a wonderful way. So like I'm always drawn to kind of like, I'm drawn to emotions and drama and sort of more vague states, but interpersonal states. But I guess what ties it together is, finding how people interact with the world and presenting it Le Guin style in a way that fosters our curiosity for that world and for our own world, and makes us kind of question our place in the world. Which really brings us back to X-Men. Like I'd say like that's like really for me personal, that's the progenitor of that kind of curiosity in storytelling in my mind.
As a storyteller, how do you personally balance out that sort of leaving things open-ended, or perhaps ending at the beginning, or how do you balance out that sort of what I consider the fun stuff, the like, when you leave a movie with a buddy, back when I used to go to the movies when I was young.
Oh, yes.
You leave the movie and you just couldn't, you go to Denny's because it's open 24 hours, and you would talk about like what the hell just happened, like what, and you would argue about it, right?
Yeah,
like,
that's part of experiencing the movie is going to Denny's afterwards and trying to hash through it. Yes.
Yeah. How do you balance all that with, a bit of hand-holding isn't the right word or right phrase, but sort of without it kind of morphing into this postmodern sludge of like nothingness. Not that there's anything wrong with nothingness, or perhaps just sort of surrealistic, visceral type of moments and images and things like that. But go ahead.
What you're talking about is tying up all the loose ends. Mm-hmm. So this is where I think craft-wise, I can immediately tell when somebody has the chops to tie up all the loose ends and deliver a nicely packaged story in a way that is satisfying, but that doesn't seem to be limiting by being satisfying. And like, I guess in general, I'm going to go in the movie direction here.
Sure.
This is where I feel like in general, I think well-made horror movies are the best stories. And they offer some really good examples of how this works. So I think that like when I notice that that certain horror movies can actually explain, what the hell just happened, or who a certain creature was, or what the nature of a power was, or whatever, they can do it in a way that still leaves wonder, in a way that's still evocative, that kind of like leaves the residue of what you just experienced, that makes you feel something without having like more of like a cognitive satisfaction of like, And I think a lot of that's just very subjective. Like, but you can tell the difference between that and something that's more focused on the nuts and bolts of tying up loose ends and making sure that the story has come to an end. In my own stories, I feel like, importantly, Swallow Me Whole, my first full-length graphic novel, that also has that has an ending, has a resolution that's for me, that's sort of like, that was my jumping on point of vagueness, of like, it's open to interpretation. And I was not expecting that people would actually talk about it to each other and ask me questions. But I kind of lucked out where I really did that story my way. And, thankfully Chris Staros just had some really great input in early drafts of it. And so I went back and tried to nail it a bit better. But then once it worked, like any empire has a really good abrupt ending that I think, that I'm very proud of. But the book itself is also weirder and way bigger. And so it's confusing in a whole different way. But basically, like over the process of doing March, I was writing and penciling and repenciling Come Again. And I realized it was going to be stranger and weirder and more emotional than anything I had done before. And so the question was, how do I ground that to make it tolerable, basically? A lot of that was, I was like, okay, this is obviously the direction I'm interested in as a storyteller. So I really need to figure out what needs to be clear, so that there's room for the other stuff that maybe shouldn't be clear. And so I think that was the most important thing, was realizing that I had a responsibility to lead the reader to certain facts or realizations within the story, to ground the story, but also, I guess we're talking about like a contract with the reader, to be like, yes, you're safe here. Like I'm going to get you to the end or whatever. And like, if you give a reader or a viewer a little bit of that, it goes a long way as far as, when I think about myself as a reader, it goes a long way in terms of being able to feel free to interpret a story in a way where I'm like, this is like, my version has equal weight with the creators. And I really like that sometimes. Like it can be a delicate balance, but you have to know where to have enough clarity so that, there's enough invitation for the less clear parts that actually make the story interesting.
Right. Well, I could ask you a million more questions because I love talking to you, but I think it's a good time to wrap it up so that we can perhaps do a part 2 in the future. We sell your original pages.
It's true.
At Athenaeum Comic Art, if anyone is interested.
That's .com.
There you go. Why did you start selling your pages?
Like back in the day, like just like tabling at shows, I would often bring a couple of pages and I'd prop them up on a little easel. And in general, this is where, like, also in the indie comics world, everyone is like, a lot of people are on an equivalent level of brokenness. And so you're just like, well, I think somebody might take a chance and buy a page for this amount, but also like, I'm a person who's broke. And so I know what it's like to be like, yeah, but I wouldn't be able to afford one of my own pages or whatever. You get this skewed view of what value is when it begins to be attached to a price. And it's weird sometimes when you're still hawking your own pages, because then like not only do you have this personal attachment to your art, but also like at a certain point you're like, I don't even know how to price things or how to talk about the business aspect of that with anybody. So really once I was doing March and doing a lot of work and I was making an okay living, basically I was like, I did get some advice one time that was like, think of original art as your retirement fund because it's the only one you'll ever have. You're a cartoonist and you will die at the drawing table. This is true. Like, I mean, I'm living the dream here. I'll draw into my 90s and I will probably pull a Charles Schultz right there. That's fine. But basically, in a nutshell, it was like, if you need to sell some pages to like pay some bills or get by all means, do that. If you don't need to sell pages, maybe just hang on to them. And so I was like, maybe now is the time where I just sit back and draw and make stuff, and I don't worry about selling pages. And so I just didn't think about it for many years. And then I went back around to being like, yeah, like, how does this work anymore? But it was such a delight to meet you, and you were like, well, this is this, like DIY thing that I'm figuring out and bringing up from the ground. Here are all these peers and friends of yours who I've gotten on my roster so far. A lot of folks who I love and respect so much, but also the fact that you're coming from the right place. You're being very mindful, and you're a good listener. This is really where like the like my punk perception of people's intentions, oh yeah, I was like, Sean passes the test.
Good.
He's coming from a legitimate place, like, and so I was like, aha, I've got you covered. It was just, we made a really good personal connection. I was like, it sounds like it would actually be fun to sell art with you and through you, because you're building up something, and you're, as you've stated, you're interested in also the community aspect of making original art available in comic spaces. So yeah, to me, like, beyond that, it's nice for me to not be as involved with the business aspect of selling art, because it involves like acknowledging that like I don't know what is necessary to know to really make the best and fairest decisions about how much to sell art for, or a lot of the details of its availability, so it's nice to kind of hand that over to somebody you trust.
Well, it's been such a pleasure working with you, and I remember our first conversation, and I was like, I'm going to talk to Nate Powell. So I was so nervous because you're a big deal, and I think particularly with all of your pages, but specifically March pages, it feels like history in my house, and there's a responsibility, I think, to it. I mean, I take all this very seriously regardless, but I think I like that I get to be precious about the art in a lot of ways, and the artists don't have to worry so much about it. That makes me feel good.
I still like break a little bit of a sweat every time I have to like handle some March pages, even though there's like a giant stack of them in a bin just in the corner of my studio. It's like I have one right here just in case I needed it, and anytime I have to touch them or move them, where I'm like just like the responsibility.
Yes. Well, we love your art, and I want to thank you for your time tonight. Again, we'd love to chat with you at part 2 at some point. Folks should go out and buy. I'm just looking at my pile of your books next to me. Should go out and buy all of your books, but Fall Through and Lies My Teacher Told Me, especially since those are the new ones. Is there anything else that you want to plug before I let you go?
Well, the only real-time thing is Come Again, which is the book before Fall Through, and it is tangentially related. Like they're part of the Nexus universe or whatever. All right. I think I just secured the very last 20 copies in existence. Like, it's out of print. And without giving details or anything, like, it looks like it's going to be out of print for a little bit. I don't know what's going to go on. But I think at SPX here in a few weeks, and at CXC, I will have the only copies left in existence. So if you haven't read it, or if you are interested at all, I have exactly 20 copies, and you should definitely get one then if you can.
Wow. You heard it here first. And again, I mean, Come Again I love it. I love that book. And I'm sure those 20 books will sell very quickly. So go to SPX and CXC and go grab a copy and get Nate to sign it for you, because he's nice like that. Awesome. Well, thank you, Nate, so much. And thanks to the folks that are watching now and the folks that will watch it recorded. It's been a fun journey of celebrating year 3 of Athenaeum Comic Art. We'll probably be doing more chats in the future. Maybe not like 8 of them in 1 month, but who knows? Who knows?
Well, Sean.
I'm a crazy person, but thanks to everyone, and have a good night.
Have a good night. Thanks.